The region around Beiseker was first settled in the early 1900s. There were no established roads, just rough trails meandering across the rolling hills. The first settlers disembarked from the train at Crossfield and made their way east across the prairie to Beiseker. A colonization farm had been established to receive the settlers' families, cattle, machinery, and belongings.
We stopped in Calgary for a day or so and then came to Crossfield and then came out to the colonization farm, and from there moved out to the land. The land was bare. There was no road, there's no houses, there's no nothing. And then we had to pitch up tents and stay in tents until we had something built. It was a big tent, and we different, some slept here, some there, and so that we all had room to sleep. All the furniture, everything was underneath the tent.
Well, first of all, we lived in the tent until, was it a few days after Christmas, a few days before Christmas? Lived in the tent. But if I said I'd ever got cold in the tent, there was 3 or 4 inches of snow laying around outside, I'd be lying, because I never got cold. We had good bedding. We had a heater in there, but the fire would go out, and my mother'd get up in the morning and start up the fire, and by the time us kids got up, it was nice and warm in the tent. And then they built a house, and after the house was built, they moved in. We laughed at why we lived in there. Next summer we went to work and got some clay out, got in there and tramped a little fine straw they had in it, and that's what they plastered it with. It was rough, but it was better than nothing.
It was a 2-room house. It consisted of the living room and kitchen, dining room combined, and a bedroom with 2 double beds. Hattie and I had one bed, and Mom and Dad had the other, and Reinhard probably in a cradle, which they had those days, and all the relatives, Grandma Wagner and Grandpa Wagner and Uncle Rich Wagner and Aunt Emma Wagner, they slept on the attic. To get to the sleeping quarters in the attic, you had to go on the outside stairway. That was built outside of the house, so that you got up there for your night's rest.
And we were eating good. We had a big garden, we had cows, we had chickens, and all kinds of animals, to kill, to eat. And then we could sell the butter and the eggs, take them into the store and trade them off for the groceries that we couldn't raise. And we got along fine. We always had enough to eat. Of course, in the fall, they'd buy about 1,000 pounds of flour. So we were sure on that, and then the other things we had to get as we needed them. There was prairie chickens around, and my husband was a good shot. When he saw them, he had them. And we always said there was no law. You could shoot as many as you wanted.
Ranches had been established in the area in the late 1870s and before the farmers arrived. Cattle were wild, roaming freely, and horses were an important part of life, supplying transportation and horsepower.
We shipped 15,000 horses from the district from Calgary to Carbon to eastern Canada. When we first came to the ranch out there, my father bought all Moss's horses and cattle as well as the ranch. And at one time there was 700 horses with the Box D brand on them running in the sandhills. They were big domestic horses that just needed to be broken in. They were broke and broken and shipped to Saskatchewan. We figured on $15, a margin of $15 a head. And we'd buy them here for from $40 to $80 a head, and $30 a head expenses. If you'd get $300 a car, that was a lot of money.
Cattle ran out in a wide open range, and in the fall of the year, everybody'd get together and they'd have huge roundups. They'd round up thousands of head of cattle, and by the brands they would sort them out, and then each rancher would take his cattle to his home place where he'd winter them. most of the ranchers didn't own a whole lot of land because all they needed was a home place to winter them. The rest of the year, they just simply run a wide open range. I know he did say that he used to market some of them at Carbon. I imagine a lot went to Calgary, and it was during that time that the man that's very well known, Burns, who eventually set up the Burns packing plant, was also running huge herds of cattle in this area. They'd be driven on hoof with saddle horses because, you know, there was no other transportation at that time. The only transportation really was teams of horses and wagons and saddle horses. The ranchers never did settle up on the high plains, you might say. They always sought the river flats because there would be natural shelter for the cattle in the form of bush and trees, and of course there was also water. In those years it used to rain a lot more in this country, and as I said, they would just go out and cut their hay on any good spot out in the open range. There was no fences, there were no boundaries. Tradition dictated who would get the hay off a certain area. Had they been cutting hay there previously, it'd be anticipated that that rancher would cut hay there again. So it was just wild hay, and it grew very well in this country at that time. But you must remember, in those days, the loam was deep, it was a heavy grass cover, and the grass did very well in this area.
With the advent of farmers, the free range was partitioned and fenced. Ranchers sold off their cattle, and ranches slowly evolved into farms.
The CPR opened this land for settlement, which was our free range up until that time.
Most of the farmers moved into the area about 1908 to 1910 and later. And as a consequence of that, the prairies were being ripped up by huge steamers that would pull about 12 bottoms, but they'd only move about 1 mile an hour. But nonetheless, they did tear up much of the prairie, and fences were built and deeds were taken out.
The people who settled in Beiseker were largely of German extraction. Noted for their good farming practices and husbandry, they had been invited to Russia to share their knowledge of farming with the Russian peasant. They had eventually emigrated to the American Northwest. They were enticed to the Beiseker area by the Calgary Colonization Company, a company whose founder, T.L. Beiseker, bequeathed his name to the town. German language and traditions were cherished until the Second World War. Land was cheap in the early days. Farmers were attracted to the area because of its affordability, and it was available to anyone who was courageous enough to farm.
And there was an old homesteader there with a sod house and barn, and there's 2 quarters up here, the CPR. So we bought out the homesteader and these 2 quarters for $18 an acre. Fishers and Times, they had money, and they bought a steamer in the States and had it shipped up. And then they did breaking for people. They broke for us 100 acres. Then later on, we'd break it ourselves with the sulky plow. Holy smokes, you'd make 8 rounds in the forenoon, 14-inch rounds, you know, shears like. And then 8 rounds in the afternoon again. So you had 16 furs laying there. Slow business. When they had the old thrash machine like the one that sits out here in the corner, you had all the bundles and pitch them in, load them up, and stoke it, cut it, and stoke it, which was a lot of work and hard work. Tell you, you bend down every minute or so and pick up a bundle and set it in the stook, and you only allowed so many bundles to a stook. If you made them too big, then if they got wet, they wouldn't dry up. And we used to get rain, and they would get wet.
On the farm, everyone from the biggest to the littlest had their own work and the responsibility of some particular chore. With no running water, electricity, or plumbing, the farm wife could be expected to work from sunup to sundown.
I had to do all the chores. Milk cows, separate, especially in this busy time of the year. which was hard work. I used to bake about 40 loaves of bread because no bought bread. They used homemade bread for lunch for school, you know. So you did a lot of baking, a lot of cooking, and you'd have a big garden. You'd can vegetables because you had no deep freeze. At thrashing time, they used to take a whole quarter of beef, and they'd have a pulley, and you put a sheet around it, and they'd pull it up on the windmill. And then every morning you'd let this down and cut off what you need for the day, and it would keep. When we had children, I'd wash on the board, give the baby the bath, wash on the board, and then hang the clothes out. How many children? Ended up with 13. I always said, I thought, well, it'd be nice to get married, be your own boss, but that doesn't always work that way. Virginia, and Lena, Marie, Raymond, and then I think it was Vera, and Pat. Am I running out? Who comes after Pat? Jeanette, and Fritz, Edna, Jerry, Carol, and Joan. Is that 12? Because 13, the baby died when he was a little fellow, Douglas. Yeah.
The settlers came to an area where doctors were scarce. The people had to look out for one another and became quite adept at helping out.
Well, about 10 o'clock that evening, we all went to bed. I was downstairs in my mother's bedroom, and they were upstairs with Jeanette. So about 10:30, Reinert came down, and he said, Ella isn't feeling well. Well, I said, rush to Beiseker and get Vera. And Reinert never had a hair out of place. His hair was always combed just the right way. So there he stood at a mirror combing his hair. I said, stop combing your hair and get Vera. So he went to Beiseker, and Vera phoned Dr. Fowler. But Dr. Fowler, it was the spring of the year when it was dry, and soil had drifted into the ditches along the highway. And as he went to Linden to pick up the nurse, he backed up to turn around, and his wheels stuck in the car and were spinning, and he couldn't get out. Well, I stared out of that upstairs window until after midnight, and finally Vera said, well, Eva, you have to hold the lamp because I think the baby is going to be born. I thought I'd faint, but I didn't. She said, you have to hold the light. I said, all right, I'll hold the light. But I said, I'm not going to look. Well, she said, you better look because you may never see this again. I said, I don't intend to ever see it again. Well, the baby was born. And I hope, as I've said, I hope I'll never live through that experience again. I suffered a lot more than Ella, I think.
Times were tough and life was rough, but good times and happy times were to be found whenever the neighbors came by or when a fiddle was tuned, a dance attended, or even a simple hymn was shared by the family and friends.
I can remember the time in the Beiseker Hotel, they had Saturday nights, they had dances there till 2 o'clock. Lancaster Mill would ride in it and put our horse in the livery. One didn't cost us anything. He says, put him in, because it wasn't used. And then we danced till 2 o'clock in the morning. Then we rode home 14 miles horseback. And then the next morning, we had to be in the church here on a Sunday at 11 o'clock, Mass.
Well, we had always had music. I always had to play for everybody that came. Different ones with instruments. My dad played the trumpet. And we had lots of gatherings.
My dad played the violin. Well, when they sang, my dad usually played the organ. He was a pretty good musician. Sometimes he would play the violin, and my Uncle Ed, he would chord on the organ for him. He made some pretty good music.
The Reddings and the Alberts were our neighbors and very good friends. So when they would come, they would stay for the whole evening. And Mr. Albert and Mr. Redding, they played the mouth organ. And then they would dance in the kitchen. And of course, we kids just loved it because there was nice cake and sandwiches, and you could have all you'd like. And then when we would get too tired to watch them, they'd dance all evening and stay until daylight the next morning to see the way home with the horse and buggy. And we kids would just lie on the bed crosswise because there wasn't room for all of us. We'd just lie there with our clothes on, just take our shoes off. Boys and girls, all of us, because we were only maybe 7 or 8 or 9 years old. We'd all pile onto the bed and sleep there until the neighbors were ready to go home.
There were many little schools that dotted the prairie in the early days. These schools had to be within easy riding distance or within a reasonable walking distance for the children in the summer.
Well, when we first come in here, Davis School is that we belonged to, but that was 5 miles from our place. In the summertime, when the horses were working in the field, we walked 5 miles.
Sometimes I had to walk all that ways, too. I'd have crochet thread in my pocket because at that time we girls had to sit down and learn to crochet and knit. And one day Mom went out after I was gone for a while. She noticed something. The spool had come out of my pocket and was thread all the way.
And then there was a school started in the building that Hagel and Held owned. And there were homemade benches for desks. And there were about 4 students sitting in each row.
We played baseball during recess hours, or pom-pom pull away, or prisoner's base, or things like that.
Oh, we bought tobacco, and we'd hide it in the school barn. And after school or at dinner time, we'd go down and have a smoke, and they used to search you for tobacco. If you had tobacco in your pockets, they'd reach in it. They caught me with tobacco one time. He gave me a couple of, well, he always had a strap. Give me a couple on each hand. I felt it too for a while. And I wasn't the only one. There was lots of others. We were smoking in the barn one time. Oh, there was 5 or 6 of us. And he came down to the barn, and boy, I tell you, everybody run. Some jumped into the manger, and some, well, they didn't run. They stood there. But he sure gave everybody a bawling out. But this barn was full of smoke, so he knew everybody was smoking.
I was really scolded by a teacher one time because I had lipstick. And at that time, I was the only girl in high school. The boys would tease me, and they had found a lipstick in my pocket. And I didn't know Miss Bertheson heard this, and I said, "Oh, somebody took my lipstick." Well, I stayed in after school that night, and I had a real going over for using lipstick.
Oh, we used to play ball, but we made our own ball. We had no money to buy a new baseball, so we made one out of old leather, off of shoe leather, and stuffed it up with old rags. And that's how we played ball with that.
We used to go to town Sunday afternoons and play ball, but then we just, there'd be a bunch of kids come in there. You choose up sides. You play against each other, eh?
Pioneers were largely responsible for providing their own nourishment, but they had to rely on the local grocery store merchant for some foodstuff.
At that time, we still served the customers. Everything come in bulk, such as peanuts, peanut butter, prunes, raisins, dates, figs, dried fruits such as dried apples, dried pears, dried apricots. White sugar come in 100-pound bags, and if you spilled an ounce, you were an ounce short when you finished weighing the sugar out. If a man come in to do the shopping, in most cases it was the men that did the shopping, they would bring in a grocery list and they would just hand it to you. And then they'd come back maybe in an hour after or a half hour after and pick up their groceries, and away they'd go. A lot of the farmers, they didn't have any income of any kind till the fall of the year. They would, after harvesting was over, they would sell their grain, and then they would come in and pay the bill. If they weren't lucky enough to have a good crop, sometimes you'd have to wait for another year and hope that they would come and pay it. Well, we also took eggs and butter in trade and then ship it out and ship it to Calgary and sell it. I remember we used to pay 8 cents a dozen for eggs, and we'd have to ship them in, get them graded, and end up sometimes getting 6 cents a dozen for them. Butter, well, we used to pay 8 cents for that, and If we got a chance to sell it to the local people, we would sell it for 8 cents.
Trains were an important element in the new community, acting as transportation and communication links to Calgary.
Like I say, groceries and any kind of small parcel traffic. And carloads, well, they picked up grain, they handled the grain out of there, and there was a time when cattle were shipped out. I can recall both railroads handling cattle out of there, and they used to bring in coal, carloads of coal, because in the early days, why, that was what people used to heat their homes. And I can remember carloads of flour coming in too to the store. They buy in the fall, a whole carload of flour would come in, and there were occasions when carloads of fruit used to come in too, and they would sell, the storekeepers would sell the fruit right out of the car. If you got a telegram, it was your responsibility to see that it was delivered to the person it was addressed to, and if it was humanly possible, why, you had to deliver it. And if it was out in the country, well, the best you could do sometimes, if you could get a hold of a neighbor that was out that way and happened to be in town, well, you send it out with him, otherwise you put it in the post office.
The CPR and CNR were also indirectly responsible for some of the early spring floods in the town. The 2 rail beds acted as 2 dikes that trapped spring runoff. The culverts were too small to pass the rush of water onto lower ground, and the water backed up.
In the spring runoff, the water started to move, and the creeks started to overflow. And right across here at the tracks, coming down from the northwest, why, it was all one lake, and the water was going over the top of the tracks. It was right up that high to the rails. Well, that didn't last too long. When the big push was over, it went back down again, but there was sure a lot of water Main Street. And some of the places I had to put up some sandbags in front so it wouldn't run over into the buildings on the sidewalks and so on.
Many of the voices of our pioneers are stilled now, but the voices of those who remain tell of a life of endurance and survival in a primitive land. Their voices reflect the humor that helped them to bear the small hardships, and their voices reflect too the deep and sustaining faith that made them endure the larger ones. One can hear the astonishment at the great task they accomplished. They have cast a great shadow and